So the only thing we're looking for here is we are looking for what goes into 5, 50, and 50, what goes into r to the 6th, r cubed, and r squared. So out of 5, 50, and 50, what number goes into all of those? What's the largest number that goes into all three of those? 5, all right? So that's going to be what we're going to take out there. And then we look at the variables, r to the 6th, r cubed, and r squared. We always want to take out the lowest because for the lowest one, we can't take out more than it has, right? So what's the lowest number of r's that we have? R to what power? 2, right? So we're going to take out r squared. And then in parentheses is what is left over. 5 divided by negative 5 divided by 5 rather is -1, right? And then this term started with 6 r's. How many did we take out? 2. So we have 4 left over. -50 divided by 5 is -10. And how many r's is left in this group? 1. And then +50 divided by 5 is going to be 10. We took out both r's. There are none left. So this would be your factoring here, just taking out the greatest common factor. So go ahead and do 3. Go ahead and do 3, the one right below it. So for this one, your common number was 5. Your common variable was r to the 1st power. And on the inside, 8r to the 4th plus 8r plus 1. If you remember, if you divide anything by itself, you get 1. And you did 5r divided by 5r. So you should have had 1 at the end there. Question this one. We have 1, 2, and 8. There's nothing that is in common with those. And then we have n squared, n, and then no n. There's nothing in common with that. So there's nothing we can actually take out to start with. So now we're going to look at the last term, in this case, -8, factors that multiply to give you -8 and subtract to give you 2, or add rather to give you a -2. So factors of 8, we have 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Which one of those subtract to give you 2? 2 and 4. Specifically, I want a -2. So which one's going to be negative and which one's going to be positive? 4 is going to be negative. So I'm going to say n minus 4, n plus 2. And I can check this by saying -4 times +2 is -8. -4 plus 2 is -2. And so I know that I have the correct ones. I could actually FOIL it if I wanted to. Double check it. So go ahead and try 7. Try 7 there. So for number 7, you were looking for factors of 12 that add to give you -7. So this means they should be the same sign and they should both be negative. So -3 and -4 both multiply to give you +12 and they add to give you -7. You'll notice you have a number in the front, but remember our first step is to look for a common factor. And so we're going to look for a number that goes into all 3 of these before we ever start to factor this. All right, so what number goes into 5, 65, and 200? 5. So we're going to take the 5 out. What about a variable? Can I take a variable out here? All right, so I'm going to just take the 5 out. I'll be left with b squared, 5 divided by 5. What's 65 divided by 5? 13. Yes. And then 200 divided by 5. So now that I've done this, I have the 5 on the outside, and I'm going to look at the inside and see if I can factor that. So I'm going to look for factors of 40 then that add up to 13. Factors of 40 that add up to negative 13. So if I list my factors of 40, right, I have 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 4 and 10, 5 and 8, right? So which of those add up to 13? 5 and my 8. Specifically, I need negative 5 and negative 8 because I want it to multiply to give me positive 40 and to add to give me negative 13. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to leave that 5 out there, and then I'm going to say b minus 5, b minus 8. And that will be my factoring. If I were to FOIL those parentheses and then distribute that 5, I would get what I started with up here. And so my final answer would be 5 on the outside, b minus 5, b minus 8. So go ahead and try 10. So this is called factor by grouping. I teach you this method because when I get to section 6 and 7, I actually use this method to teach those sections as well. Factor by grouping is used when you typically have 4 terms. So all the ones we've been doing so far have had 3 terms. They've been trinomials. Factor by grouping basically uses common factors to factor a 4-term polynomial. And so we have these 4 terms here, y cubed plus 3y squared plus 4y plus 12. It's in standard form here. And then you basically just put grouping around the first 2 terms and around the last 2 terms. And then you look for a common factor just in those small groups. And so if I look at this first group, you'll see that y squared was a common factor. And that's what they took out. And they were left with y plus 3y plus 3. And then for this one, a common factor was 4. And they took out a 4, y plus 3. So you'll notice we have 2 y plus 3s here, right? 2 y plus 3s. And we look at this as though we're factoring it again. We look at this and say, what's in common between this side and this side? And what's in common is that y plus 3. And so if we were to take the y plus 3 out of each of those, we would be left with y squared plus 4. And this is actually the factoring for this 4-term polynomial. And if you were to FOIL this, you get y squared times y, that's y cubed. Y squared times 3, that's 3y squared. 4 times y, 4y. And 4 times 3 is 12. So if you were to FOIL this, you would get what you started with, which tells you this is the correct factoring of it. And so what you're looking for is you're looking for a common binomial once you factor by grouping. So let's do one of these. Factor this 4-term polynomial. Now there's something that you have to do when you have one like this. So the first step in factoring this is I'm going to put parentheses around the first 2 and around the last 2. Now in this case, my middle sign here is very important. My middle sign is minus, all right? Anytime when you have grouped and you have a subtraction in between your groups, you have to go in and change this the very last term, in this case negative 10, you have to change the sign. Whatever it is, change it. It was a negative, I changed it to a positive. Had it been a positive, I would change it to a negative. The reason you have to do this is if I were to distribute this through, I would want to end up with the same thing I started with. So if I were to distribute this negative through to this second term, negative 1 times 5n is negative 5n. Negative 1 times positive 10 is negative 10. And negative 10 is actually what I started with. And so anytime you group after a negative, you have to change the last sign. All right, that's your rule. And so I grouped behind a negative, so I have to change the last sign. And now I'm going to look at these individually. So I'm going to look at this one first. What do I have in common between a 4 and an 8? What's my common factor? 4. What about the n cubed and the n squared? What's my common factor? N squared. So 4 divided by 4 is 1. N cubed divided by n squared is just n. Then I have 8 divided by 4, that's 2. N squared divided by n squared, so take out 2, I don't have any left. And then I'm going to leave that minus there, and I'm going to now look at this one. 5n and 10. What do I have in common between the 5 and the 10? 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. I did not take out any n's, so I leave that alone. 10 divided by 5 is 2. All right? And so now you'll see that I have 1n plus 2 and 1n plus 2. I have that in common, so I can actually pull that out, n plus 2. And then my next group is what's left over. I have 4n squared minus 5. And that is my factoring for this polynomial. If I were to FOIL that, I would get what I started with up here. All right, and you can check it. So if I were to say n times 4n squared, and remember this is just checking, this is not my answer, 4n cubed. N times negative 5 is negative 5n. 2 times 4n squared is 8n squared. 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. If I put that in standard form, 4n cubed minus 5n plus, or in standard form, we'll go this way, plus 8n squared minus 5n minus 10. And that was my original problem. And so that's a way to check that, yes, I did that factoring correctly. So go ahead and try A and B. A and B at the bottom of page 496. So for the first one, 5t cubed came out of this first group, 6 came out of the second, t plus 4 was what was left over, so that's what you pull out first. And then you have 5t cubed plus 6 left. So remember, your first step is to look for a common factor. And so for these, your first step is to look for a common factor between all of them. So I'm going to look at 12, 10, 36, and 30. And then I'm going to look at p to the fourth, p cubed, p squared, and p. All right, between 12, 10, 36, and 30, do I have anything in common?
2.
A 2, right? And that's about it, because after 10, right, is 5, and 5 doesn't go into 36 or 12. All right, so the only number that I have in common here is a 2. What about my Variables. Can I take any variables out? I can take one p out, right? Because of that last one. And so for these, because I know I'm gonna factor by grouping, I actually put brackets here because I know I'm about to do some grouping. So then 12 divided by 2 was 6. P to the fourth divided by p leaves 3. 10 divided by 2 is 5. I took out 1, so that leaves 2. 36 divided by 2 is 18. I took out 1, and 30 divided by 2 is 15. And I need to continue factoring. This is still 4 terms. I still need to factor more. And so now I'm going to factor the inside by grouping. I'm going to leave the 2p on the outside there, and I'm going to factor the inside by grouping. So I'm going to group these two, and I'm going to group these two. I grouped behind a negative here, so I need to change the second sign. It's negative. I need to change it to positive. And then I'm going to continue with my factoring. So I'm going to leave 2p here, and I'm going to look at my first group. Can I take anything out between 6 and 5? No. What about the variables? Can I take any variables out? How many? Yeah, 2 of them. So I can take p squared out. And I'm left with 6p. 6 divided by 1 is just 6. I took out 2 p's. I'm left with 1. 5 divided by 1 is 5. I took out both of those p's. What about between 18 and 15? Can I take anything out there? What goes into 18 and 15? 3. And I cannot take any variables out because the 15 doesn't have one. That leaves 6p plus 5. And I'm going to keep going. I'm going to still leave this out here. But now I see that I have this in common. So I'm going to put that group. And then I'm going to look for what is left over for my second one. That's p squared minus 3. You'll notice I'm using the sign in front of it. And that would be my final answer here. 2p, 6p plus 5, p squared minus 3. If I were to FOIL those binomials and then distribute the 2p, I would get my original equation up there. All right? So go ahead and try check understanding number 2, top of page 497. So your common factor between everything was 3m. Take that out first, then group the first 2 and the second 2. In the first group, your common factor was 3m squared. You were left with 5m minus 1. In the second group, your common factor was 2. You were left with 5m minus 1. Again, leave the 3m here on the outside. The common group was 5m minus 1. The leftovers from that group, 3m squared plus 2. scenarios that we did not see in your book. The first one is, when I grouped this, the first group had obviously 8x squared, which left 5x minus 6, but the second group doesn't really have anything in common other than a 1. Anytime it only has a 1 in common, you want to list it. If you don't, then you will not have a group here. You will just have 8x squared, which is incorrect. So when you look at this group and you say there's absolutely nothing in common, you always have a 1 in common. Always a 1. And so if you look between 5 and 6 and say, nope, there's nothing I can take out, but there's also no variable, you need to put a 1 here. All right, and then you'll see your groups are 5x minus 6, 5x minus 6. That came out. And then I was left with 8x squared plus that 1. 8x squared plus 1, all right? The other thing we have not run into is when I group behind a negative and I had a positive here. For some reason, all the examples we've done have had a negative there. And so for this one, the first thing I did was take out the 4, and then I grouped these. And when I grouped these, I grouped behind this negative. So I needed to change this positive 16 to a negative 16. Remember, if you group behind a negative, your last number has to be changed to the opposite sign. This was positive, I need to change it to negative. And then in my first group, I could take out an x squared, that left me 3a minus 8. I took out a 2, that left me 3a minus 8. So my group in common was 3a minus 8. I had the 4, 3a minus 8, and then what was left over was a squared minus 2.